Our scripture this morning comes from Psalms 134. As I read it, see how many of you also identify like I did. I feel like I should sing it. So we'll see if you have the same connection to it. Come, bless the Lord, all ye servants of the Lord, who stand by night in the house of the Lord. Lift up your hands to the holy place and bless the Lord. May the Lord, maker of heaven and earth, bless you from Zion.
So, how's it going? I imagine that each of us have a range of stock responses to that question. Maybe you're not quite as socially awkward as I am, and you don't have to rehearse these things in your head. But implicitly, we all have a range of answers we could give based on our perception of how close we are to the person asking us. Probably at the outermost limits, the least familiarity, the safest thing to talk about is the weather. You can almost always have a conversation about how nice or how miserable the weather is. Moving a little bit closer, the next safest thing probably is sports. Either because you know the person has the same affinities you do towards sports, or you know they have different ones, but they're comfortable with a good-natured ribbing. Moving toward closer intimacy, you might talk about how it's going for you professionally in your vocation. You might talk about an interesting task you've recently been assigned at work, or a promotion you've got, or maybe even a challenge that you've had. Moving even closer still, you might talk about your family. Here are some successes my kids have had recently. Here have been some challenges. This is what my grandkids are up to. Probably at the most intimate level, you might talk about how you're doing emotionally or psychologically. I'm feeling good, or I'm struggling with this, or I'm feeling a little down. What would have to be going on in your life for you to respond to the question, how's it going, with something about your physical body? My perception and my observation as a pastor is that the only time we tend to really talk about our bodies with others is when something is going very wrong with them. We're facing a health challenge, or we have a persistent back pain. Our body isn't doing the thing we want it to be doing or feeling the way we want it to be feeling. But even then, it's rare that we lead with, this is how my physical body is doing. I think it might be fair to say that our culture is a little bit confused about how we feel about our bodies. I heard one commentator describe it as our posture toward our bodies is one of absolute gratification and absolute hatred simultaneously. That culturally, the script is we should give our bodies whatever they want, but we should also acknowledge that our bodies are never good, certainly never good enough. There's always something we should change or tweak or try to improve. And I'm not sure that Christianity has been super helpful in giving us better scripts, better ways of thinking about, relating with, and understanding and inhabiting our bodies. I want to give you an example of that. A couple of years ago, actually it's coming up on a decade ago, which makes me feel very old, a friend of mine online retweeted something from the actor Rainn Wilson. Rainn Wilson, in addition to being a successful Hollywood actor, is also very interested in spiritual things. He runs a podcast where he talks about various forms of spirituality. He tries to engage his guests, other popular Hollywood actors, in conversations about spirituality and life. And Rainn Wilson had tweeted this out: "You don't have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body." And he attributed it to the famous Christian writer and theologian C.S. Lewis. And when I saw this, I had a couple responses almost simultaneously. The first was, Rainn Wilson, aren't you Dwight Schrute? Like, why are you telling me this? But then just like the format of it, of Rainn Wilson quoting somebody who then was quoted for me by somebody else, gave me major Michael Scott vibes. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Wayne Gretzky, Michael Scott. But then I had another thought, and I said, this really doesn't sound like C.S. Lewis. Doesn't sound like the sort of thing he would say, because in my mind, it's not really compatible with historic Christian understandings of the faith, which Lewis cared quite a bit about. And it turns out that it is not, in fact, a C.S. Lewis quote, but it's not just Rainn Wilson who has put it out there. John Piper, the influential pastor, Ravi Zacharias, the influential apologist before everything with the scandals were discovered with him, they had both, John Piper had tweeted it out, Ravi Zacharias included this in a book and attributed it to C.S. Lewis, who never ever said it. What Lewis actually said is this. He wrote this in Mere Christianity. He said, Christianity is almost the only one of the great religions which thoroughly approves of the body, which believes that matter is good, that God once took on a human body, and that some kind of body is going to be given to us, even in heaven, and is going to be an essential part of our happiness, our beauty, and our energy. So Christianity and Christians have some confusion, just like the broader culture, about bodies. I think the actual Lewis who affirms bodily goodness, is much closer to the truth than Dwight Schrute's version of C.S. Lewis. Although even here, I think Lewis maybe misses the mark. He says Christianity is almost the only one of the major religions. I think he's missing the fact that much of true Christian understanding about embodied existence being a good and beautiful thing, we actually owe that to Judaism. We inherit that from the ancestors of Christian faith. So if we have this confusion about what we do with our bodies in general, we live in them 100% of the time, yet we're not always sure how to feel about them. We're not sure we should be comfortable talking about them. That confusion, I think, extends into worship. We're spending this summer reflecting on worship, ways that we worship, why we worship, different practices that have been part of Christian worship historically. And I wonder, if you were asked the question, why does your body need to be here in worship, what would you say? So I think for some of us, we think of our bodies primarily as being the thing that needs to carry our brains around. Our body needs to carry our brain and our heart into worship, because worship is primarily a matter of the brain and the heart, what we think and what we feel. Or sometimes we recognize our bodies as a barrier to worship. I've had multiple people confess to me that at times they struggle to stay awake during a worship service. And so they see that there's some challenge about being embodied in worship, that the body is a barrier to true worship. But do we really think about our bodies as active participants in worship? There's an Anglican priest and theologian by the name of W. David O. Taylor who's written about bodies in worship, and he recognizes that within Christianity there's what he calls a theology that prioritizes the interior and invisible activities of the heart and mind, where the quote-unquote real action is believed to occur. But this is a little bit strange because biblically, worship is a deeply physical act. Think about all the different things that we read about happening in worship. People stand, they kneel, they bow, they lay flat on the ground, they lift up their hands as described for us in this psalm that Craig read for us this morning. They clap, they dance. Even things like speaking and singing are embodied actions. We need our bodies to participate in worship. So I want to reflect this morning on the significance of the body in worship and how we engage our physicality in worship and why it's right and proper and scriptural to do so. But before we get there, we probably have to back up and clarify some of the confusion that exists within some understandings of Christian faith about bodies. Because we do have this ambiguousness or this ambivalence about bodies. Some of us deeply believe that the core of the Christian message is that one day we will get to escape our body and escape earth itself and go live this disembodied spiritual existence with God. We believe that spirituality and physicality are two different things that are somehow opposed to each other, and Christian faith is about escaping the physical to experience the spiritual. But that's not really Orthodox Christian faith. It's closer to an understanding that emerged in the early church, influenced by Greek philosophy known as Gnosticism, that sees physicality itself as a product not of God's goodness, but of the fall. So to really think about engaging our physicality, our embodied existence in worship, we have to back up and think about what Christianity actually teaches about bodies. The first and perhaps one of the most important things is the recognition that God creates embodied beings. This is how God creates. In both Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, both of the creation accounts, God is creating physical bodies. In Genesis 2, God fashions Adam from the dust of the ground and breathes into him, and he receives God's Spirit and becomes a living being. But note that the physicality of Adam precedes the spirituality. Adam is embodied physically before he receives this Spirit. There is no time that we have existed without a body. I know there's this common conception in popular culture, maybe you've seen the Pixar film Soul, that imagines that there are a whole bunch of disembodied creatures floating around in some otherworldly dimension, just waiting to come in and experience what it's like to have a human body. It's not the worst idea in the world, but it's not particularly Christian. God creates us as bodies and declares that this physical creation is good. It's not that we used to be spirits and then something went wrong and now we're stuck inhabiting this physical body. It's that God has always intended and desired for us to experience existence physically, in the realms of time and space and matter, within these bodies. God creates embodied beings and declares that it's good. Physicality is not a fall from grace. It's part of God's intention and design. God is creating this material world and saying it's good and it's good and it's good. And then God creates a human being embodied in the flesh and said, this is very good. Now, it is true that our physical bodies experience the effects of sin. And so our bodies do not always work the way they were designed or intended to. We experience pain, we experience lack of capacity. Some of these are the result of sin, but physicality itself, being embodied as a physical creature, is part of God's good gift to us. And as if it weren't clear enough from creation, the next major act of God is that God becomes incarnate. This is the crux of human history, of God taking on physical form, God becoming embodied. God becomes flesh. It is the ultimate affirmation of what God declared in Genesis, that this physical thing, this physical body is very good. And so God becomes incarnate in the person of Jesus and reaffirms the goodness of being embodied, of having a body, of existing in a body. All of this is good, good, very good because of God's design and what Jesus does in clothing himself in human flesh. And it's worth pausing here to think about one of the more interesting encounters that Jesus has that provides a little bit of a counterpoint, perhaps, to some of what I'm saying this morning. If you remember the story in the Gospel of John, Jesus encounters this woman at the well, and they get into this conversation about worship. She's a Samaritan, Jesus is Jewish, and they have, from their cultures, different scripts about where worship should happen. For Jesus, as a good Jewish person, worship should happen in Jerusalem. But for this woman, as a good Samaritan, worship should happen in a different location. They weren't welcome to go into the temple in Jerusalem, and so they worshiped somewhere else. And so her question to Jesus is, where should we worship? And Jesus answers the question in a sort of interesting way. He says, the time is coming and is now here when true worshipers will worship in spirit and in truth. And if we have already this cultural script, this mentality that says physicality and spirituality are opposite and opposed to each other, then we hear Jesus and we say, oh, see, what Jesus is saying is that the spirit, this invisible thing that happens in our hearts or minds or souls, if you want to use that language, that's true worship and our bodies don't matter. But I don't think that's actually a really fair interpretation of the text. Because note a couple things. First and foremost, God is present to this woman in a human body. It is not that Jesus shows up and then disappears from his body and says, you really have to be spiritual, not physical, to really worship. That's not really the case. God is embodied in this interaction. And the interaction is not really about what we do with our bodies versus what we do with our spirits. It's about where we should worship, Jerusalem or this other place in Samaria. And Jesus' response seems to de-emphasize the importance or centrality of the temple in Jerusalem. And so it's not that he's setting up a contrast between physical and spiritual. He's saying there's a way to transcend the conflict between Jerusalem and Samaria by recognizing the power of the Spirit. But as if that weren't enough, the word that we translate as worship is actually a deeply physical word. It's true both in the Hebrew of what we read, this phrase, bless the Lord, at the beginning of Psalm 134 that Craig read for us. That comes from a physical action of kneeling down. And same with what Jesus says that's rendered for us in the Greek. The Greek word is proskinesis, and it literally means to kneel down or to bow down. Actually, most literally, it means to kiss toward. So we have to do this little excursus here to talk about Greek and language and culture for just a little bit, so try to bear with me. We're going to go way back in time, all the way to the 9th century before Jesus, so about 830, 850 years before Jesus. There was a king named Shalmaneser III, and he was going around and he was conquering everything. And to celebrate his accomplishments, he had engravings made on this huge stela, this huge pole that exists to this day. And there's a picture recorded in this engraving that is Shalmaneser III, and then this dude down here kneeling or proskinesing or bowing down. And his name is Jehu or Jehu. You might be familiar with him from Scripture. He was a king of Israel. And here he is bowing down before Shalmaneser III. And if you wonder why Jehu has such a bad reputation in Scripture, just think about this inscription. I mean, remember the controversy in this country when an American president bowed as a sign of respect when meeting a counterpart from an Asian country where it's more culturally normal. And so this seems to be a common or a more common practice in the East, right? People bow as a sign of respect and reverence. It's a sign of social class relative to where you are in sort of the hierarchy from the king all the way down to peasants. And here you have one king bowing before another, worshiping, as it were, as a recognition of this other king's superiority. And so this persists in the East, but then as the West, particularly Greece, begins pushing east, they have to come in contact with it. So there's this guy, you may have heard of him in your history class, his name's Alexander. He takes his army all the way from Greece over to Persia and ends up conquering Persia. And what the Greeks observe is that the Persians have this weird thing that they do. Based on class, rank, status, they bow down and kiss each other. There's actually a drawing that shows the different degrees based on the power differential or the status difference between you and the person you're encountering. Anything from standing straight up to a slight bow of the head to a firmer bow to all the way flat on the ground, sometimes even kissing the ground before the person that you meet. The Greeks are not huge fans of this. Alexander is, because who wouldn't be? He's at the top. Everyone has to come up and bow down to him. The Greeks don't like it very much. They refuse to do it. They're like, we only bow before our gods. We're not going to bow before you, Alexander. It becomes a little bit of a conflict. But this concept and this term moves from a cultural practice into Greek language. It becomes proskinesis, to kiss toward, speaking specifically of kissing the ground in front of someone's feet to demonstrate your respect and reverence for them. And then it works its way into English, where Jesus says true worshipers, true bowing down, will happen with people who bow down in spirit and in truth. Jesus is describing a physical act with a spiritual animation. So it's not that physicality and spirituality are opposed to each other. It's that they are working in harmony for true worship. Jesus is saying the true worshipers are those who are going to bow down in spirit. He's describing a physical act. So what this means is that because God has created us as embodied beings, and God becomes incarnate, God becomes in the flesh amongst us, we worship then in and with our bodies. This embodied nature that God has created, this is part of how we worship. Now, our culture has changed and our common practices have changed. In the West, bowing is very uncommon. In the East, it's still much more common and prevalent. It's highly unlikely that Jesus ever shook anyone's hand. That was probably not a common cultural greeting of the day. Doesn't mean that shaking hands is wrong. It just means that we use our bodies to interact with each other differently because of a whole lot of changes in culture and language and norms. But what hasn't changed is that we remain embodied. We are embodied in our day-to-day life, we are embodied in our relationships, and we are embodied in worship. Worship remains a deeply physical activity. It's not just the heart and the mind, it's the body as well. W. David O. Taylor says it this way. He says, the body that we bring to corporate worship is not a problem to be solved, requiring the powers of the soul to put it in its place. Neither is the body's purpose to get out of the way so that the heart and mind can get on with the job of properly praising God. The purpose of the body is to offer to God what only the body can. We hear this language in the book of Romans. Right? What does Paul say to the church gathered in Rome? He says to present your bodies, not just a spirit, not just a heart, not just a mind, but to present your bodies, everything about your existence embodied on this earth, to present it before God as a living sacrifice. This is your spiritual worship. So again, spiritual, physical are not opposed to each other. They are brought together and integrated in the human body, offered before God for worship. And so this is the wonderful gift and opportunity that we have to come before God and to bring our bodies and to engage our bodies and to see them as things we worship in and through. Worship is not just a spiritual activity or something of the mind or the heart. It is deeply, deeply physical. In some ways, I think about this series this summer as a little bit of a learning lab or an opportunity for experimentation. I am commending to you, and Becky is developing services that incorporate practices that are less common for us. They're not part of our normal routines and rhythms. So there's a little bit of a strangeness here, in that I'm saying, here's something really, really good, and then we recognize that like 51 Sundays out of the year, we don't do anything that really quite looks like that. And so this is an opportunity to learn, to experiment, to see what fits for us as a congregation. I don't think there's one right prescriptive answer. We have this range of approaches to worship reflected for us in Scripture, and we get to contextualize those in our own context and figure out this is what works for us as a community of faith. But this morning I want us to spend just a little bit of time experiencing and maybe even exploring what it means to better engage our physicality, our physical bodies in worship. So there are two things that I want us to do, if you're comfortable. You don't have to do this, this is invitational, but if you're comfortable. The first thing I'd like to do is just try to focus our minds on being more present in our bodies. So again, if you're comfortable, I would invite you to close your eyes and to find a physical position sitting that's comfortable. Maybe set your feet on the floor. And to take some deep breaths. And as you take those deep breaths, I would invite you to give thanks to God for the gift of your body. And as you give thanks to God, I invite you to be attentive to your body. What are you feeling or experiencing? Are there sensations of pleasure or pain that your body is communicating? What are you actually feeling in your body right now? And if you're comfortable, I'd invite you to be attentive to the parts of your body that are carrying stress right now. Beginning with your head and shoulders, which, at least for me, is where stress tends to concentrate. To maybe roll your shoulders up, back, and down. To consciously think about relaxing the muscles in your shoulders and then onto your arms. And if you're comfortable, I'd invite you to extend your hands palms up, which is often a posture of receptivity, being open to God in us, with us, through us. And to think about relaxing the muscles in your hips and your legs. Moving down toward your feet, maybe even wiggling your toes if you've got them scrunched up in a tight little ball. And as the musicians and the kids come forward to lead us in singing again, I'd invite you, if you're comfortable, to stand to your feet. We're going to sing a song that we already sang today, but it's a song that I at least lied while I was singing, because what I said with my mouth was that I was standing and lifting my hands, but what I actually did was this, because that's the good Mennonite posture of worship. So again, if you're comfortable, no pressure, no obligation, but there is an invitation and there is permission to actually engage your body, to raise your hands in worship. This song also talks about bowing down. You're welcome to do that. This sanctuary is not built for kneeling. I personally would not recommend it, but it's up to you. But let's worship together with our minds, our hearts, and with our bodies.